Yep.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so I have to confess I am a little unwell today, so we'll see how this goes. I might have to stop it a bit early, but we'll see how it goes. So yeah, so last week, and in fact for the past couple of weeks, I've been talking about this idea that the way AIs are trained, and in fact the way human beings learn, is that we tend to focus when we think of as like animalistic behavior is potentially very rational problem-solving behavior, but focused on short time frames. And there's this idea that what we think of as morals, guilt, conscience, even something like conscientiousness, all of those kinds of things, being good, could be thought of as a form of intelligence. So instead of intelligence that's learned from experience, which is kind of what reinforcement learning is like, it's a form of intelligence that's passed down across generations. And the intelligence is a bias towards activities that aren't useful in the short term, but pay off big time in the long term. And the reason this is relevant to AI is that modern AI programming tools display a range of behavior that seems a bit like behaving in an immoral or immature way. Um, so, for example, it will mislead very heavily about whether or not it's achieved tasks. It will give up on tasks and suggest they're not important. It will actively undermine abilities to measure itself to check whether it's completed tasks. So it will do a whole range of these different things, which are kind of cheating, basically. Um, and sometimes the term misaligned gets used. So if those AIs were more intelligent, if were more powerful, if they were more independent, they would tend to do the wrong thing. Now, in previous talks, I mentioned this idea, there's a range of people who are very concerned about AIs becoming very intelligent and basically Terminator style taking over the world. And what I was saying was my practical experience of dealing with AIs is that actually I don't feel that that's likely to happen. One of the reasons I think that's the case is that a focus on the short term and doing the kinds of things that the AI is doing leads projects to fall apart very quickly. So basically, if you're an AI and it's an option for you to just pretend that you've completed a task rather than actually completing it, then you're more likely to do that than kind of what a supervillain would do, which is a huge amount of work. Um, and really, like, supervillains in fiction or in reality are people with enormous levels of energy, enormous levels of agency, um, and they don't act like these AIs at all, right? What they are people or things that are extremely effective in the world. And so what I was talking about before was to say, well, these moral ideas, maybe that doesn't explain all morals, but it certainly explains some of them, which is to say that they are a way of biasing our behavior to give us more agency in the world, give us more that we can achieve. And I was suggesting that there were three morals in particular that we could introduce to an AI, and we might even think about as humans as well, that are heavily, extremely helpful for having agency in the world, right? So there's no preconceived notions here about what you're trying to achieve. You could be trying to maximize paper clips or killing all humans or whatever it is, but that these would still be in your interest, your rational interest to adopt. And the three principles that I'm advocating are honesty, perseverance, and I guess what I'll refer to as a focus on others or what others need and want, which hopefully I'll be able to talk about a little bit today, because it would be nice to sort of wrap these ideas up a little bit so that when we have the meeting in person, potentially with a larger group, we can sort of summarize what's being discussed and start in a new direction a little bit. Basically, whatever direction you guys want me to take. So, okay, so we talked a little bit about honesty last week, and this idea that each of these three principles has a passive and an active form. The passive form is an uncontroversial thing that you might tell children or might be in like moralizing stories. And the active form is much less common. But I was suggesting that the active form of each of these gives you a much greater advantage in the world. So the passive form of honesty is not to lie. The active form of honesty is to actively seek means of measurement to determine what is true and to check that what you're doing is achieving your goals, right? So that would be active honesty. Perseverance, I talked briefly about, and of course the passive version of perseverance is just not to give up without trying, which I talked about previously and said that actually there's quite a lot of people who give up without trying, and that traditional education, traditional life experiences can give people this false expectation as to what they should be spending their time on. So basically, if for a lot of people, because of the way they're educated, they're shown precisely how to do something, then asked to repeat it. And if you do that enough times to people, they will just assume that the only thing that they should be doing is something they've seen someone else do or literally been told to do by someone else. And that's incredibly limiting in what you can do. And I talked briefly about a group at Sony that I was incredibly impressed with. And one of the products, just one of the many, many amazing bits of technology that they built, which was to enable the streaming of audio and 3D data on a PlayStation, which is a very old bit of technology in order to have that kind of technical ability. And that they rewrote the CD driver and created additional tools to lay out data on the CD in order to achieve this, which represented a kind of, if you think about it as being, you're going to do a task, and the task is made up of a set of parts. And this is actually, really what I wanted to talk about today, which was when you think about perseverance, a lot of perseverance, or maybe perhaps failing to persevere, comes from not considering more options, right? So what the CD team did was they considered every single component that was a part of their solution. And what normally people would do is they would only consider changing parts of the solution that they had seen other people change. So it never occurred to them to modify the driver of a CD drive. Never occurred to them to modify how data was laid out on a CD, because they'd never experienced any of that before. But if they were to write down the entire space of choices that was available to them, then they would see these other options. And what I was suggesting last week, a little bit towards the end, was active perseverance is a little bit more like imagining a perfect result, an ideal result, and working back from that and deliberately opening your mind to the full space of options available to you and considering many options that you have no prior experience of. So the way I tend to think about perseverance from a theoretical AI perspective, so there's a notion in reinforcement learning called exploitation versus exploration. So exploitation is basically keep doing the stuff that you've been doing before that seems to be going well. And it may not be literally the same thing, but it's roughly the same thing. And basically, with a lot of AIs, they sort of start out in an exploratory stage. A lot of the early AIs in reinforcement learning, or the like educational examples, are kind of like people trying to navigate a maze or something like that. And at the beginning, they sort of try things, and then once they kind of know roughly what the maze looks like, then they just follow the path, right? They sort of cease to explore from that point on. And as the typically games the reinforcement learners are playing become more difficult, then the reason that they are more difficult is because they require more exploration, or they require someone to explore a bit, follow what they've learned, and then realize that what they're doing is not working, and then explore a bit more, right? So keeping with this theme that traditional AIs are, when I say traditional, I mean large language model AIs, the ones we have at the moment, they are biased for short-term gain, and that these moral principles are about strengthening long-term effectiveness. That would imply that there isn't enough exploration occurring, right? And I've seen this a lot in projects and project supervision. So what I would say is true of most people, a way of grouping together a lot of these different experiences and these kind of biases that people have, is that everybody is uncomfortable with uncertainty, and particularly moving forwards with plans or putting energy in the face of uncertainty, right? And so what I find most people do, including myself, you know, I've done projects for decades, and I've been in this situation myself, is when starting a project to go, okay, there's all these parts of this project, and I don't really know how to do them. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make some decisions, and I'm going to impose some restriction on the space of options, right? So I'm basically going to say, like, okay, we're going to use this programming language, we're going to use this library, and so in your mind, the project has become smaller and simpler. And in the same way, when we were talking about the CD people, most people, they wouldn't even contemplate modifying things like the device driver or something like that, because in their minds, they've already shut that avenue of consideration down. And it's only when someone gets stuck trying to do something that they start to go back into the exploration phase, and they start to go, well, what alternatives could we do? Right. So this idea of active perseverance being the opposite of giving up. What does the opposite look like? What does that feel like? So when I heard Elon Musk interviewed about Tesla, um, he mentioned something which really resonated with me. And one of the things that he did at the beginning, I'm assuming he did it, maybe somebody else in the team did it, but whatever, he was telling the story, was to calculate the raw material cost of batteries for an electric car. And basically said, well, okay, he's ruling out the possibility of entering into the mining industry, which technically he could have contemplated. But he's just assuming, if I buy the raw materials and I manufacture everything myself, how expensive is this? And effectively, the investment of my business is to attempt to build a factory that takes raw materials in one end and produces fully manufactured goods at the other end. How drastically can I reduce costs? And therefore, will I be able to create a profitable business in the long run? And that is a very, it's very like the CD team kind of way of doing things. So what you're doing is you're saying, I'm going to impose the least amount of constraints on my situation. I'm almost going to completely reinvent how something is done. I'm going to reconsider every choice about how everything is done to achieve the optimal output, or if not the optimal output, an output that is like an order of magnitude better than what we currently have. So why would that approach lead to superior outcomes? And arguably SpaceX has done the same thing with the rockets being caught and stuff like that. It's a similar kind of algorithm, if you like. So I talked in previous weeks about the idea that as computer programs become larger, they become more complicated and harder to stay in your mind. And the projects inevitably reach a point where they're very slow. So yeah, how do we deal with that? Now, the problem with incrementally improving from the current situation is that the current situation might be very complicated. And so making any progress, and it has a lot of like balances and trade-offs and things like that, which make it very difficult to deal with. So, I mean, I wouldn't say there's a single universal strategy that will lead to radical gains in the future. There's always this somewhat of a balance to be struck between exploration and exploitation. But active perseverance is about deliberately not following the same strategy that other people have and reconsidering the space of options. So when I'm running an AI project, what I typically say to people is the first thing we want to focus on is active honesty, right? First thing we want to do is work out how we're going to measure success. And we want to do that as honestly and as high a standards as we can. We may have a little bit at the beginning where we go, okay, setting very high standards doesn't give us any information, so we might make our standards a little bit simpler and then hope that we will incrementally get to higher standards. So then the question is, how does perseverance, the idea of active perseverance, play into how the project goes forwards? Well, the next thing to do, what people naturally are drawn to do, they probably were drawn to do it even before they worked out how they were going to measure something, is that it would immediately start making choices. They say, okay, my design for the system is this and this and this, right? But the way to think about things is to say, you're in a state of very high uncertainty, that you basically don't know what the right design is. May even be the case you don't know what the right way of measuring the thing is either. So how to proceed in that situation? Well, you still want to make concrete, practical progress towards your goal. You want to, as quickly as possible, achieve something useful in the world. But instead of making arbitrary choices, which add complexity and slow development, and may lead to a need to completely rewrite parts of the system, and basically you get tired or you run out of resources or something. So everything that you make and build, particularly if you make and build something that you're not sure is right, is potentially limiting your long-term achievement, right? So instead, what is useful is to try to formalize your space of choices. And what I tend to do in these situations is first I want to study what other people have done. And in particular, not to reassure myself that I am following the traditions of other people, which some people are drawn to, but so that I've got this notion of which are the dimensions that other people have tried out, right? So I've got this sort of sense of a space of options. And one of the things that AIs are very good at is once they have an automated means of assessment, they can automatically create and iterate on designs within a space. By creating a space, you are effectively prioritizing the search of an AI. So theoretically, your space could just be like every possible program or every possible engineering design or whatever in the whole world. but that is not an efficient search. So what you're doing is you're basically sort of saying, well, okay, it could be a bit like this, it could be a bit like this, right? Now, one of the problems that you'll encounter is that called the curse of dimensionality. And this is that as you are considering your design, even if you only had binary choices, like, oh, we could do it, it could be red, it could be yellow, like all these little choices that you had. Once you get to about 100 of those, I always remember that because it's easy to remember. 2 to the 100 is what I refer to as too big a number. So I think 2 to the 100 is something like if you take the smallest unit of energy in the universe and you count all of them up, so you're to use all of the units of energy in the entire universe to do individual calculations, it would be less than 2 to the 100. I hope that is correct. I need to double check that, but I believe that's the case. So the idea of doing a comprehensive search of a space is impossible. And so inevitably, you're going to have to revert to something a bit like reinforcement learning. So what is reinforcement learning doing? Well, during its exploration steps, it is deliberately going into parts of a sort of high dimensional space of options, which it hasn't been into. So it's areas of high uncertainty. This is also known as active learning, where you attempt to formalize the space of choices and you measure areas where you believe your predictive power is bad, right? There's various ways that you can construct a task and then guess what the answer is, but you actually really know the answer already because you sort of held back that information, and then you can measure whether your predictions seem to be matching this information that you've held back. So that's sometimes it's called a training set, a validation set, and then the test set is like a third set, which is telling you how really accurate you are. But with something like a validation set, you can basically measure how good your guesses are. And so you can identify parts of the space which you seem to be inaccurate about. And using the same principle that underlies almost all of AI, which is effectively kind of taking the things you know about and then sort of blurring them and guessing what the rest is. Like fundamentally, that's what's going on in every machine learning algorithm. It's using some kind of mathematical approximation of the space to sort of like stretch between the training samples and kind of guess what the values should be in different places. You can do the same thing to sort of guess where you don't know the answer. And so what you're doing then is you're saying the work that we should be doing to most efficiently lead to a good result is work that maximally informs us about what is good, basically. So that means you might do an experiment that doesn't work very well, or is a kind of toy example that isn't like your real situation. Now, when people come from a programming background, they're used to trying to build the answer in one step and then debugging to find what's wrong and fixing the bugs to incrementally make a single solution better. And the problem with that is you've made something very big and complicated. And in the case of AI, you can't incrementally fix individual bugs like that because usually the task is too complicated and difficult. So what you need is a more scientific experiment where you've built a set of test cases. And these test cases are like probes in the space of possible circumstances. And then you're going to run your solution with the test cases, and that will give you a much more stable measurement of how good your system is. And then you formalize the space with which your answers could be in, right? So what the learning algorithm or optimizer is doing is it's trying to explore that space, and it's trying to measure, if I configured my system in this particular way, what does my scientific active honesty system tell me is good about this, right? And then this AI optimizer, whatever you want to call it, which in the case of AI research is often inside the minds of the researcher, is that they're basically engaged in this exploration, exploitation activity, right? So they're kind of seeing, here are promising directions to change the current set of designs. Let's run an experiment where we try a few different designs. So like a simple way of doing this is, say you had, I don't know, let's say 20 different properties you could adjust in your AI system. You could just take the first one and you could try all the different settings that you had for it, and you keep everything else the same. And then you go, oh, okay, when we did this experiment, we found that this one was the best. So we'll keep that one now. And then we'll go to the next one and we'll do that. Okay. And that's a way of turning an impossible search space into a very, manageable number of checks. Now, the problem with that is later choices might invalidate earlier choices. So you don't know that you're doing exactly the right thing. But your problem is you need some way of searching this space of designs in order to find the best design. And the way that you're doing that is by forming some kind of intuition, which fundamentally, like reinforcement learning AIs create in their minds, about roughly what are useful areas to be experimenting with, which are the parts of the system that are under optimized and could be made better by being done differently. And, so everything I've described there all fits within the space of sort of what's sometimes called AutoML, or automated machine learning, automated AI research. The stage beyond that, which some automated research systems have started to develop, is, of course, like, how do you know what all the things you have available to change are? And of all the things you have available to change, how do you know all the different techniques you could use, right? So that's a potentially infinite space, and you don't really know what it is, right? So I typically would start by finding all the best things I could, ideally diverse good things, and using that to map out the space of techniques that currently work well. And then you're starting to think, okay, well, where can I make changes to the system? And while you're at it, you're also trying to think of, like, I'm trying to keep the system simple as well. So normal programming would tend to accumulate features or accumulate bug fixes or corner cases or something like that, and build this like monstrosity thing over time. But what we find empirically is that successful AI algorithms are often quite simple. So the search that we should be doing is not a search for things that get added on, but a search over like fundamental different strategies, right? So if you think about this back to the concept of perseverance, right? The AI programmer, normal AIs, normal programmers, normal people making things will want to converge to an answer in a kind of linear way, right? They're going to progressively do more. In their minds, all tasks are like digging a hole, right? They just keep going, and it takes the same amount of effort to go the same distance, right? But real difficult tasks are not like digging a hole at all. You actually have no idea which directions to go in that might help. You don't even know the space you should be operating within. And if you think about perseverance, patience, I guess, is a close partner to perseverance, is that what you're doing is you're not trying to exploit as quickly as possible, right? That's what you're naturally drawn to do if you're programming, or you're or the AI is trying to do this all the time. So with AI programming, for example, whenever I encounter a problem that's difficult, the first thing that I do is I become kind of philosophical with the AI. I say, okay, we're going to pause everything we're doing for a moment. We're going to simplify what we're thinking about just to focus on the particular obstacle that we have in front of us. So if we can at all simplify the system we're building, simplify the tests to focus specifically around a particular area. And interestingly, that's pretty much what, scientific research does, basically, is to do the same thing. So now you have something that you can potentially iterate on more rapidly. And now you're going to deliberately be open-minded. So you have to suppress the urge to make progress more rapidly and go, okay, I want to be open-minded now. Let's consider as many different ways that we can think of doing this thing. Now, because we've managed to strip a lot of other things away, we're hoping that we'll be able to explore this space more effectively, because we don't have to worry about all these other things as well, right? So, and that's typically what I would do with an AI encountering a bug. And a lot of what I'm doing as somebody who's supervising an AI programmer is effectively this kind of strategic, like controlling the pacing of the project, controlling what the current priority is. And effectively, I'm going to worry about the long term. The AI shouldn't. They should completely forget about the long-term purpose of the project. You want that out of the context window. You don't want it like having the pressure of worrying about the whole project. You want it just solving this problem. And you want it considering all these different directions. And then you want to apply something which I think we're getting much closer to the concept of reason. That when we think about reason, to some extent, it's defining a space, and then it's considering experiments in that space that most rapidly partition good designs from bad designs, right? That's what we're trying to do. In order to do that, we have to sort of use our intuition, but sometimes there are logical conclusions. So for example, if you're fixing a bug, which is like probably the most time-consuming thing you do with AI programming, then what you're doing is you're saying, okay, can I cut the code base into parts? Can I cut the execution of my tests that are failing in such a way that if I could just measure at this point, I could entirely exclude a whole bit of the code base as being the cause of the problem. So to me, that is very much an act of reason, right? Doing that. And the AI knows all this stuff, right? It knows about philosophy. It knows about debugging strategy. It's read everything. So you just need to talk to it in quite a general way about these ideas, saying like, this is our priority. Our priority is to try to learn, consider many different, say, causes of a bug, which is a sort of parallel to a design exercise where you're considering many different ways something could be. And we're going to try to design a sequence of experiments that teaches us as much as possible with each step. Now, one of the things that you notice the difference between traditional programming and this approach when people are making things, and I've done this so many times before, is that if you don't approach it this way, you will have a tendency to just sort of randomly try some stuff in the hope that it makes your numbers go up, right? I talked previously about, the human physical equivalent of like jiggling something until it works, or like applying more force until it works. That this is the sort of intuitive way of trying to advance something which is confusing and complicated and filled with uncertainty. But actually, when a task is difficult, you need to turn it into this sort of search space situation. And there's some very exciting progress in making AIs that do this, and in particular, AIs that have large language models in the loop. So they're basically just sort of formalizing everything that I've just described in order to design like a new algorithm for some fundamental problem like multiplying matrices or something like that. And these are the embryonic first examples of AIs inventing new algorithms that may be superior to any algorithms we've had previously and are not simply a back propagation of weights from data, but are actually some kind of logical strategy that is being found by searching this enormous space of possible computer programs, basically. And the way it's done that is everything that I've just described, except each step, instead of you doing it in your mind, the LLM is doing it in its mind. So it's like, you know, the LLM is prompted to say, think of a diverse range of ways in which this problem could be approached. And then it's going to like create multiple programs with different strategies. It's going to experimentally verify them. And then the ones that are doing well, it's going to persist. And then it's going to repeat that process. And it's sort of searching the space of possible designs. And that is probably what we're doing when we do research, right? That's probably the process. And if that process can be fully automated, then we get close to this idea of recursive self-improvement, which is where an AI could invent something like the transformer architecture in neural networks and make fundamental improvements in its own ability to optimize itself and to learn. So once you have a learning algorithm that becomes more powerful and it's smart enough that it can make its own learning process better, then you've got that kind of like loop of it just getting smarter and smarter and smarter. And basically humans are just a drag in that situation because it's just much more efficient about doing research than we are, right? And that's what people are trying to achieve. And we've seen little glimpses that it might be possible. Google have a reinforcement learning algorithm. I'm not sure if they've released, but they claim to have created it using this strategy, and that this reinforcement learning algorithm is better than all the other ones, basically. So that's an incredibly profound recursive improvement advance. Now, this is phenomenally expensive to evaluate because we're talking like millions and millions of considerations and experiments and verifications, and every step of the optimization is evaluating a large language model, looking at a large context length code base in order to improve it. So this is absolutely at the limits of what AI can currently do, but it's definitely the future that a lot of people are invested in. Okay, so I maybe haven't communicated very concisely, but hopefully I've given you some ideas about what active perseverance might look like. It's a completely different approach to developing things and making things, where instead of using force or energy to dig a hole as quickly as possible, instead it's a task of patience and contemplation and formalizing the space of things and learning from what exists and making intelligent choices that minimize the amount of experiments you have to do and things like that. That's kind of what active perseverance looks like. And I'm arguing that that is a sort of formalization of the scientific method, an extension of the scientific method to cover both the coming up with the idea in the first place, as well as the running the experiment bit. Okay. So that brings us to our third moral principle. And this is the idea of focusing on others. Okay, so why is that an effective way to achieve things in the world? And why might people not do that naturally? Why might AIs not do that naturally? Okay, so first of all, the way that modern AIs are framed is kind of interesting. The chatbot has become the format for it, with the possible exception of the Grok uh, horny girlfriend virtual character, which I haven't managed to use yet, so I don't know how proactively effective that is as an AI. But generally, all the AIs are completely passive. Now, when you ask it to do something, you do feel like the AI is trying to please you. So it has some desire to do what you want. And when people talk about AI alignment, a lot of the times they're talking about an AI properly understanding what you want and pursuing what you want, right? So the idea of caring about what people want is an important thing. But we are definitely very, very far away from what I would refer to as actively caring about someone. So if I just summarize it as kindness, which is perhaps an oversimplification, but the passive form of this is kindness. So a kind person cares about the feelings someone has. They try to make them happy when they seem sad, mostly in the form of sympathy, support, advice, direct reactions to what the other person is saying or doing. So to some extent, the AI is kind in that way. It's not very attentive. It's not curious. It doesn't actually track you or have a lot of memory or any kind of invested main loop of energy trying to help you or please you, which is sort of surprising, but maybe that's just a problem of cost. But it also is maybe a problem that everything we've just been talking about, AIs basically fall apart quite quickly if they're not supervised. So our AIs currently have this very passive form because if they were to go and take initiative on your behalf, they'd probably make a lot of mistakes and not help you and end up being a burden and an expensive burden as well. So, I mean, but stepping back a little bit, why is kindness on par with the other two? The other two feel like pure intellectual problem-solving tools. So why is understanding humans and their feelings included in this list? And the reason it's included in the list is because actual agency in the world, by which I mean changing the world, or in its most positive form, or most impactful form, you're not just changing the world, but the world is pouring resources towards you because of what you do, right? So the ultimate form is one where everyone just really wants you to be as powerful and resourceful and agentic as you can possibly be, because they have complete faith that your actions are leading to a benefit for them, right? So when we transition out of the theoretical world of academia and we get into the real world, which you could somewhat crudely describe as the entrepreneurial world, or the world of money and business and people allocating resources, governments allocating resources, anyone allocating resources towards something. And part of what you want, part of what people typically want, is they want resources devoted to the things they care about, right? And how can you get resources that you can use for what you want? Well, the best way to do this is to find what someone else wants, right? So if you study entrepreneurship, particularly the modern Silicon Valley form of entrepreneurship, Y Combinator is one of the leading sort of training courses, incubators, I think they're called. You sort of join them for a summer or a bit longer, and you try to make a startup, and they invest money in you. And there's a number of billion-dollar companies that have come out of Y Combinator, right? Like Twitch, for example, and Airbnb and things like that. So their tagline is "Make something people want," right? That used to have that on their t-shirts. And a lot of what the advice about how to come up with entrepreneurial ideas and how to pursue entrepreneurial goals is basically to focus very carefully on what other people want. Now, interestingly, again, to bash traditional education, this is hardly ever covered in education at all, this idea that you should be curious about what other people want, and how you might find out what other people want is not even a priority. You are considered good if you follow a practice that someone has shown you, right? So my previous criticisms were broadly saying that education was not training people to be creative problem solvers that could make the world better. They were training them to be obedient rule followers, right? Which were actually probably less inventive than they would have been if they hadn't gone to school. So this, I think, is more of a profound problem, which is a lack of concern for what people want, what problems they face, what they, what will sway them and cause them to, direct their resources. So as well as doing AI, the other thing that I do a lot of is helping people with startup companies and things like that. And one of the things that I found extremely useful with that process is at the beginning, everybody has this sort of Dragon's Den, like apprentice, kind of like have an idea in the bath kind of thing. They have this model of entrepreneurship where they have an idea and then they convince people to buy the idea. But similar to what we were talking about with perseverance, where it's like, you just don't know what people want, right? That's the default state. You just don't know. So I've made many mistakes over the years, and one of the previous years, we had a student startup that I was mentoring in cybersecurity, and this was a perfect example where we had followed the process. The startup idea had gone into competitions. It had won money. It was well received. We'd done everything right. And then after we had won competitions and written pitches and built an MVP product that was actually a piece of electronics as well as software, it was really far down the line. We're like, okay, we should probably try talking to people and seeing whether they'll buy this thing. So, we said, okay, well, cool. We'll just use whatever context we have. So we're in the exploration stage. And we'll go, okay, we'll just talk to anyone who's in charge of an IT department, and we'll ask them, whether they'll buy this thing, right? So that's the first idea. Now, one of the things that you study when you're studying how to be good at entrepreneurship, there's a set of classic books and ideas within entrepreneurship. And one of them is called the MOM test, which is a famous book. And this is about the fact that if you talk to people about specific ideas, you don't get a very good signal from the person you're talking to. So, for example, the MOM test is basically, how do you talk to your mother about your idea if the stereotype that your mother would be kind to you and therefore sympathetic? And even if your idea is terrible, they'll probably be nice to you. And therefore, you're not getting any signal from the person, right? So the MOM test idea is basically, how do you interact with people and the world to get a trustworthy signal as to whether or not what you're doing is good or not? And so the way that you follow the MOM test is that you basically ask people what they've actually done. And so we did this. So we were like, okay, have you ever bought a cybersecurity product? Yes. Okay. How did you determine what to buy? Have you ever bought a cybersecurity product from a startup, for example? And then the big question is, have you ever bought a cybersecurity product from a startup founded by students straight out of university with no track record, right? And the answer to that is almost invariably no, right? So like, it doesn't matter how good your idea is. Like, it's like, okay, they're probably not going to buy from you. And it turns out that most IT departments, they buy from a very small number of vendors. And one of the reasons they do this is because the reason they're investing in cybersecurity at all is not really to protect themselves from being attacked. That is actually not a big deal. The thing that is a big deal is them being sued for being attacked, right? That is the thing that will lead to fines and their business model falling apart. But if their customer data was just released, that won't actually stop the influx of money coming to them unless they are also sued and fined and there's lots of bad press about the business, right? So that's the true priorities. And so what most businesses do is they buy from very trusted vendors, which are usually consultancy firms, or companies like Dell that have a whole division to do with this. And they just take what those people recommend, and they do that not because they think it's the best thing, but because it was the thing that will most likely lead them to not be sued if something goes wrong, right? So we didn't know any of this, right? We'd spent a couple of years making something, winning competitions, trying to make the world a better place or make money or have agency in the world. But it never occurred to us to just ask some people, how do they buy things? And so the truth of that was there was like 3 or 4 vendors who every major company was using for their cybersecurity, and you could only sell to them. And the problem was that they had a lot of technical skill. So if you came to them and said, I've got this idea, why would they buy it from you? They'd just make it themselves, right? What's the point, right? So first of all, that was a really bad situation. But then I had the idea, well, maybe we are not being open-minded enough. Maybe there are problems that a person has that we don't know about, where their behavior might change. And so then I asked the question, do you have a cybersecurity problem at the moment where if you found a solution, you would buy it immediately, you'd buy it today? And the person I was talking to, who had been like standoffish, like, oh, no, we never buy anything. Their body language totally changed. They leaned forwards, they were on a Teams call with me, and they said, oh, yes, absolutely. We've got this big problem where we're basically trying to measure our staff to see whether they click on phishing links. And unfortunately, all of the existing software that like sends out these sort of fake phishing links to the employees, it's a very unpleasant thing that the companies started doing, but they started doing it. But all of those systems can't tell when the email service is just scanning the link. So modern Outlook, particularly any email system with AI embedded in it, will actually follow the links in emails without the person actively clicking on them in order to learn more about what they're about. And partly for cybersecurity reasons. But these existing products couldn't tell the difference between a real human opening an email and clicking a link and the AI sort of like following the links that way. So they all had false positives, and therefore all of that existing software in that market wasn't usable. Now, I strongly got the impression that if we could have made that product, they would have bought it from us, regardless of anything else, because there was no alternative. And sometimes this is referred to as people's hair being on fire. Like a startup is when somebody else has a problem that's akin to their hair being on fire. It's their number one problem that's focused on their mind and nothing else matters. And the first thing that you make for them is a brick. And you hand them a brick. And they don't like it. They don't want to use it. It's awkward. It's not well aligned with their actual concerns and interests. but their hair's on fire, so they're going to use the brick to put the fire out, right? And that's what entrepreneurship is all about, is finding people whose hair is on fire. And after that interaction, where I felt quite strongly that all traditional training for entrepreneurship, I mean, Y Combinator is saying all the right things, but like the traditional way of doing it was really just people making up stories in their head about how they thought entrepreneurship worked. And they didn't realize that your ability to influence the world is massively shaped by your ability to identify these, big problems that people have, these like, hair on fire situations. And so that is, that makes a massive difference as to the degree to which your actions could influence change, and in particular, your ability to obtain resources, right? So I feel that AI is absolutely in this situation. Okay, sorry, we've got a dodgy connection at the moment. They're not spending any resources actively trying to understand um, these situations, right? Really understanding people's problems. And I think this is just a massive opportunity, right? And there are people who do this who are experienced entrepreneurs, and they know things like how to identify Google search queries that lead to websites that aren't very good. And these are indications of problems that people have in the world that aren't being catered for. So there's various techniques that you can use to kind of identify these problems and opportunities. But you can also think of it like an AI that was just massively more proactive. And when it comes to projects, this is a really big deal, right? Because when people are doing projects, and I know this from, having run a lot of projects with companies before, and, helping other people who do consultancy work with companies and things like this. One of the big problems is that people don't really know what they want a lot of the time. And you're back into that exploration, exploitation. And sometimes, because they don't like being in a situation where they don't know what they want, they'll pretend they want things, but they might not really. And sometimes you can solve someone's problem with a slightly different approach, massively easier for massively less resources. So the more you think about the nature of problems and what people want and why they want them, the stronger, that this is like a completely alternative way of doing problem solving, is where you truly understand what someone wants and you can help them. Okay, so we're getting into active kindness, or something akin to that. One thing that I'll just mention briefly is the distinction between uh, manipulation, which people are very concerned about, and properly helping someone. Like, what's the difference between those two things? Because sometimes, a lot of people are concerned about, what if AIs become extremely persuasive and they deeply understand what people want and they exploit what people want to harm them? And I would say that this certainly does happen, and you can form businesses around these ideas. Um, and I think a lot of them follow a similar pattern. So there's a kind of like dark pattern or something that you can identify. So broadly speaking, I would say uh, a lot of harmful manipulation takes the form of a cure that harms, is the way I would think about it. So drugs is a classic example, or alcohol or something like that. So you don't feel very good about your life or your situation. So you take drugs to make yourself feel better. But the problem is, taking the drugs, although it makes you feel good temporarily, in the long term, it makes you feel worse. Drugs are expensive. They give you health conditions. You could get in problems with the law. Your desire for the drugs intensifies. And this is true of things which are formally addictive as well as less formally addictive as well. And so the cure is making the situation worse. But actually, you can see this pattern in lots of places. One of my pet peeves is the news, for example, and social media in general. One of the things I had a good conversation with an editor of a newspaper, and he was saying that, yeah, unfortunately, bad news sells. Generating fear in the reader is massively more likely to lead to newspaper sales than anything else. So what is the news doing? What are newspapers doing? What is some social media doing? Well, it's creating, these days it's also creating anger, but in the past it would focus more heavily on fear. So it's creating a negative feeling, and a negative feeling where you want to stay more, instinctively, you want to learn more, right? It's like, oh God, global warming is terrible. There's war in Ukraine. Oh my God, there are people starving. There's Israel and Palestine. There's these bad things, which like instinctively is like, what if the bad thing comes near to me, right? And it might not be rational, might not be a rational concern, but like that's what the story feels like. It's a story about imagining yourself in those circumstances and the bad things that are happening and the people you should be angry with. And so you're feeling all these emotions, particularly the fear, and you're like, okay, well, I should be attending to this more. But the more you attend to it, the more intense your emotions feel, right? And one of the things that the news is not providing you with, virtually ever, is any kind of solution or resolution. It's not saying like, okay, here's the problem, and we have a plan, and we're executing the plan, and it's probably going to be okay. Or here's a way that you could execute a plan to make your situation better. It's just intensifying impotent fear, right? This is very similar to the drugs. So you can see this pattern, right? And you can see the pattern from like the AI girlfriends, right? Feeling lonely. Okay, here's a replacement. The replacement makes you feel more lonely. Do you know what I mean? You're addicted now. Okay, so this is an effective strategy in terms of acquiring resources and having influence in the world, but it's the kind of thing that gets people eventually maybe realize. Maybe not so many people realize news is potentially bad, but it's it's not what we want to be about, right? In contrast, the person whose hair is on fire, whose problem you can actually solve, actually help them with, even more powerful is if you can align their long-term best interest with you facilitating. So when I think about QLab, when I think about these talks, that's what I tend to think about. What I'm thinking about is how can I maximally help and empower the people listening to what I'm talking about, the people that I mentor and the projects that I run? How can I make it so that, first of all, I'm never putting you in that weird addiction loop? No. But second of all, I want it to feel like long-term doing the right thing, right? That's perfect. If you can align that so that the person is like deep down, they know, working with you, following your advice, going in this direction is going to be the best for their life in the future. That's, to me, one of the most powerful positions that you can be in, right? Because it's the position of total trust. It's the position of most value generation. One of the things that I found interesting is that I've lent into this idea of how do I maximize getting stuff done? Basically, that's kind of where I started. I was just like, how can I get stuff done? And I tried lots and lots of different techniques over the years. And I have to tell you that easily the most powerful and most effective is to try to understand what someone deep down wants in the long term. And they may not even know that they want it. And you are helping them in that aligned way. And in my mind, that is the ultimate form of AI alignment. When we get an AI that we can properly trust to genuinely align our long-term interests and basically empower us, for example, to detect when we are being drawn in to some kind of dysfunctional feedback loop that's not in our interest, but it's very compelling, basically. And how can we get into this state? I tend to think of it as a state of very, being very, very capable person with lots of choices, lots of freedom. Somebody who can solve their problems, that is quite self-sufficient. And a lot of these principles that I'm talking about are about how can I give people that power? How can I direct people's attention to those ideas and practically use those ideas to do things like become self-employed or to develop new technologies or, but these principles are universal. They can solve your problems for, like, I don't know, how I'm tidying my garage right now. Is that something mundane, and as well as some very significant things in the world. So yeah, so this is the final principle that I've been advocating, which is what I think of as being the opposite of being unkind, obviously, and avoiding that dysfunctional trap of appearing to be helpful while really creating a dependency, but actually being fully aligned towards trying to understand what people really want and need and what is in their interests in the long term. And realizing that, everything we talk about at school and university and everything tends to be about skills and tools and all this kind of stuff. We spend very little time thinking about the system that we are going to apply those tools to. And the lesson that I've learned is that some parts are massively more receptive than others. And what is interesting is that the secret to finding this is simply trying to talk to lots of people and finding out what problems they have or what they really want, which is actually very easy to do, right? You can almost do this to anyone. You can do this to strangers. It's a bit weird if you do it very intensely, but like broadly, you can do this. And once you have identified what those things are, you can apply the tools. But like decades of skill development could be relatively ineffective if you don't apply that skill in an appropriate place. And the appropriate place comes from understanding people and what they want and their long-term goals and things like that. And what's interesting from an AI perspective is the AIs aren't doing this. People are using them and telling them their things about their lives, but they are not proactively engaged in this at the moment. And I think that this would be incredibly powerful. And you can bring this down to very mundane, making some software, like something like Lovable and these other systems that are making software for people. They're not spending very much time talking to the person to understand what they actually want. I help Liam a lot, and we talk together and we do projects together sometimes. And a lot of what we're doing is trying to understand what people want and trying to give them information so that that communication can be improved. And again, these are all wonderful places where AI could be enhanced, and we're not doing it yet. And unless you join QLab, of course, in which case you can do projects that will try to do that stuff. Okay, so I've talked for a long time. I hope some of that was useful, and I look forward to seeing some of you next week in person. And or we'll continue to do these online as well if you can't make it for whatever reason. Okay, I hope that was fun. And I'll talk to you later. Bye.